Indie mascot horror games are undead. Specifically, the niche of video games that for so many years blossomed creativity and innovation has now, despite tragically degenerating into repetitive garbage, retained and even increased how popular and successful the genre is. The aim of this video is to not only acknowledge and address the downfall of Five Nights at Freddy's and other games like it, but also to attempt actually explaining why this has happened. Why have these once beloved games nosedived into such soulless rot, and yet somehow succeeded in sustaining and even growing popularity and success? Cut it. We don't have time. I know that this has been covered plenty by better creators than I, and yes, it's a miserable topic, but its importance to me, to this channel, it's too much to ignore. I really want to keep this video's runtime below 20 minutes, but before I begin, a couple of disclaimers for, damage control. I'm sure that most of you watching are as familiar with this topic as I am, but for the sake of accessibility and avoiding assumptions about my viewers, I will contextualize some history. It'd be unfair to assume every single person watching has also lived through these events, so bear with me, it's just a couple extra minutes of your time. I am well aware that this video could easily fall into the trap of incoherent rambling and obnoxious gatekeeping. I made that intro sound emotional, but when it comes to constructing an argument, I really hope the dozen or so revisions of the script communicate a more objective and analytical thesis. Just hear me out. This whole video is just my opinion, my argument, and you may respectfully disagree, but please be civil in the comments. It will never be perfect, but I've spent weeks rewriting and re-recording this. I just hope it turns out okay and, retains its intended value. So, why are indie mascot horror games undead? Before I can argue how and why this is happening, I must first identify what is happening. So here's the context and criteria, the history, and the definitions. What does indie mascot horror video games actually mean? Indie is short for independent and refers to art created by an individual or small group independent of any large commercial affiliation, such as a AAA studio. Minecraft was originally an indie game created by the individual Notch and eventually a small team called Mojang, until Minecraft was sold in 2014. With the affiliation and financial backing of Microsoft, one of the largest tech companies in the world, Minecraft is no longer indie. A mascot is a symbolic character that in this context is designed to appeal to audiences and represent organizations, fictional or real. Horror is the art genre characterized by intention to inflict the feeling of horror, telling stories involving themes that will frighten, scare or disgust, and games. Do I really need to define what video games are? Put it all together and you get independently produced video games in the horror genre that use mascots. Mascot horror is a subgenre of horror that centers on mascots, and I'm sure you all know good examples of that. Here are 5 of the most obvious, well-known, go-to mascot indie horror games from before 2020, and here are 5 of the most obvious, well-known, go-to mascot indie horror games from after 2020. Spot the difference. Of course, they're all popular indie horror games featuring mascot antagonists, mostly based on themes of the undead and twisted childhood nostalgia. That much is obvious and superficial. I want to focus on 2 things: popularity and ethos. In terms of popularity, every game here is the same. All have been immortalized in fandom memory. The fan art, songs, animations, games, especially for FNAF, are abundant and have been for years. These are cult classics for indie mascot horror enjoyers, and even if you're outside of that culture, I'm sure you will have seen FNAF's influence on popular meme culture, be it the Living Tombstone songs, Markiplier's Let's Plays, or whatever else. FNAF is the prime example of everything stated in this video, but my claims do extend to several other IPs within the realm of indie mascot horror, just to a lesser extent. If you haven't already, I highly recommend watching Horror Games for Kids and the Problem with Indie Horror by Dags, a video I would regard as essential viewing for this topic, since Dags pretty much perfectly explains why these games became popular, and it's not something I need to linger on in this video. For those of you who haven't watched it, he analysed multiple historical examples in depth to prove that the reason all of these games has become so popular was a complex mix of factors such as imitation of similar popular games, Let's Players, and
Children is the reason why.
I'd also like to reference Etra Games' Can Bad Fanbases Ruin Gaming video, which outlines the concept of the chain base as a term for this group of games. While each IP has its own distinct fandom, they do cross over. FNAF is by far the biggest and most influential, and it is not uncommon for FNAF fans to also be fans of other indie mascot horror games within this chain base. It's a useful umbrella term for this culture revolving around indie mascot horror games, as that's what they all are. Now for the main focus of this video. Ethos is harder to define than popularity, since success can be easily measured by numbers, downloads, search results, reviews. Ethos, however, is invisible. It is qualitative rather than quantitative. It is intangible. According to Merriam-Webster, ethos means the distinguishing character, sentiment, moral nature, or guiding beliefs of a person, group, or institution. You know, for a long time I was really struggling to find the right word for the idea I was referencing in this video, but that hits a nail on the head. Here's the thing, in regards to this distinguishing character, this moral nature, the pre-2020 and post-2020 games might be united in popularity, but are divided when it comes to their ethos. Simply put, the character and sentiment of these groups, and by extension their developers, are different. Here is a basic side-by-side where I threw in as many descriptive words as I could to communicate a somewhat complex concept. The difference between the two groups, however, is striking. Think of the artistic integrity and passionate individuals behind these respective games, their intentions. The ethos of the pre-2020 games here radiates originality, authenticity, honesty, and creativity. If FNAF is the prime example of the games, then Scott Cawthon is the prime example of the developers. A family man with a sardonic disposition, communicating closely with his fanbase, and nurturing an honest, uniquely imaginative, and extremely charitable presence online. At least, back in the day. He's an old-fashioned individual with heart and soul that match the old-fashioned but innovative style of the Click Team FNAF games. Think also of the Meatly and Bendy, Dan Salvato and DDLC. These were charismatic and honest developers with personality who made games that matched their expressiveness. With newer games, meanwhile, one only needs to glance at Security Breach to see the shocking difference in ethos, or rather, total lack of it. Scott Cawthon retired months before release, and it shows. A fundamentally broken and endlessly self-referential experience that lacks engaging and original gameplay, relying entirely on the franchise's reputation and the willingness of its dedicated cult fanbase to turn a blind eye to its astounding flaws. This epitomizes the degradation of the entire chainbase. Poppy Playtime, which I like to call PP, a tasteless imitation of Bendy made purely for money and ruined by creators who were bullies, liars, and thieves, and Garten of Banban, that I like to refer to as Gob, and even blander, lazier, unpolished cash grab, also define this post-2020 ethos I speak of. Of course, I've picked the more consistent examples to demonstrate my point here, but do note that I mention tendency to follow the archetypal ethos of each era, not that every single game here perfectly fits into one box or another. There are nuances and exceptions to the two archetypes of ethos that I have presented. For example, the full release of Hello Neighbor was in 2016, yet truthfully, it conforms more to the post-2020 archetype that I have described here, given how the final release of the game moved away from the unique AI premise and more towards lore, imitating FNAF, becoming desperate for attention from Let's Players and a certain game theorist on YouTube for popularity. On the other side, despite every horrible thing that Jojo Studios has done, increasingly trying to tick popularity boxes and make money at all costs over the years, Bendy and the Dart Revival clearly retain some of its artistic and original ethos from Ink Machine. Just to be clear, I'm talking about the moral and artistic integrity here. Sure, in terms of technical design, plenty of criticisms can be leveled at all of these games. A game with a strong ethos can be boring, a game with a weak ethos can be engaging, but we're not analysing and evaluating the quality of the game loop, balancing, RNG mechanics, or replayability here. We're investigating the very soul of these games, their ability to inspire and stand out, to be creative, to be honest, and reflect developers that don't have malicious intentions. So, in summary, pre-2020 chain-based games tended to follow an ethos that was artistic, innovative, transparent, and generally hold a high standard of integrity. Post-2020 chain-based games meanwhile tended to follow an ethos that was opposite, anti-art, anti-innovation, opaque and deceitful, as well as degraded in quality and lacking in integrity. Yet, both opposites have retained the same, if not greater for the latter, status and fame, hence the title of this video. Post-2020 games, the games now, are undead. Alive in the sense of being well-known and profitable, but dead in the sense of lacking a real artistic or moral ethos in its core. Steelwall, Jojo Studios, Tiny Build, and Mob Games, as well as Euphoric Brothers, have all gradually contributed to the normalization of this new disingenuous ethos. Maybe I should thank Euphoric Brothers. Gob was the straw that broke the camel's back, the last straw that prompted many creators, including myself, to make videos addressing this devolution of this genre of games, this increase in low-quality, soulless content, because no longer was this lack of ethos a few odd cases. It has become a consistent pattern, a trend that goes back years. I know how this sounds. Subjectivity can be leveled at everything here. Who am I to judge what ethos is and use it in this way? But I honestly contend that when you look at the intent behind the design choices of all these games and of developers' business decisions, treatment of their fan bases, when you really delve into the moral and artistic values of all of these respective games, there is a clear pattern of change, a vast divide between the old and the new, between the likes of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator and Security Breach. It's complex, but I think the criteria for this ethos I speak of can be established and therefore analysed. That's not a claim to pure objectivity nor a promise of perfect nuance, just a claim to critical thinking. True and complete objectivity is a myth. All I know for sure is that something has happened with these games over the years, and it's not anything technical that's changed, it's certainly not why they're popular, so I think it's gotta be something about the very nature of these developers and these games. So, now that I've explained what is going on, how do I actually support this argument? What caused this devolution of the chain base to occur? And what reasons have led to the so-called degradation of the indie mascot horror games ethos? In this day and age, making indie mascot horror games is far too easy. However, I would actually contend that this reason is not a significant factor in the loss of artistic integrity in the Chainbase's ethos. Both Phoenix Nugget 698's An Insult to Indie Horror and Melty Milo's Indie Horror for Kids Sucks videos succinctly and thoughtfully covered this whole topic, and something that cropped up in both was this argument that it had become too easy to make video games in this niche. FNAF fangames are by far the most concentrated example of this. As is evident from the masses of fangames on GameJolt and Scratch, any kid with virtually no experience in game design can have a go at it, and in rare cases succeed. Of course, this has been the case for a long time, and standards are much higher than they used to be, but it could be argued that the sheer accessibility of this formula has led to more laziness and lack of polish, even by indie standards, with minors lacking any qualifications or experience achieving popularity, despite lacking anything resembling an artistic ethos in their creations. However, the reason I would disagree with this argument is that firstly, easy-to-make fangames have existed since 2013, if not earlier. Slender Mania is something Sonosara has covered thoughtfully in their Slender retrospective series. Secondly, in a tragic irony, out of the 5 primary examples of degraded games in this video, 3 were actually produced by larger professional companies with teams of qualified, experienced adults rather than amateurs barely out of their teenhood. This is even more embarrassing for Security Breach and Hello Neighbor 2, given how dysfunctional they were. And still are. I don't want to put all the blame on the developers, obviously they are largely responsible for this, but there are lots of other individuals involved in the process of making these games, and playing the blame game is a fool's errand. The second thing all these post-2020 games have in common are tropes. Not just qualities of horror, jump scares and chase sequences always go with the territory, but specifically locations that were populated by children long ago, mascots that are specifically designed to entertain children, hardly even altered to look scary, and tidbits of convoluted lore without any planned meaning. All of these elements defined FNAF and other chain-based games that followed, and it's gotten to the point where developers are actively trying to imitate FNAF's success by ticking these boxes without any regard to the quality or substance of their game. David Barron's How to Make a Hit Indie Horror Game satirizes this perfectly. The Chainbase started off with variety and has become more samey and conformative over time. This trend has absolutely decimated the originality of popular games, or rather the popularity of unoriginal games. PP was very obviously trying to garner attention by being similar to Bendy, and now Gob is in turn imitating PP for attention, succeeding in grabbing the profit of these fan bases, yet lacking the ethos of integrity and originality that was previously essential to get a chain-based game into the spotlight in the first place. I should also mention John Wolf's The Ups and Downs of Mascot Horror. I only watched it after finishing this video script, but it's a fantastic video that addresses this exact point about the lack of originality and uniqueness, and provides an excellent explanation of how this happened with examples and comparisons. Milo and Dags have also both mentioned my third point specifically in their respective videos. Marketability. Why develop complex and nuanced characters for a charming story with artistic ethos when you can create a meaninglessly bright, colourful, eye-catching mascot design with barely any regard to horror and the same basic traits as beloved mascots like Freddy Fazbear? Throw in that Bendy Fetch Quest clone and boom! Cash money, let's player coverage, game theory video, and with the other tropes I mentioned, a cult fanbase. This blends into my next point, which is the depressing reality that the scariest thing about these games is how influential they've been on children. No longer are these so-called horror games even trying to be scary. Aside from the Dark Revival, all of these games feature bright and colourful characters with simple shapes and appealing designs. The antagonists of these games tend to look like actual kids' characters with sharp teeth or claws done in a weak attempt to pretend that they are supposed to be scary. Any semblance of genuine horror, authentic attempts to grapple with mature topics and disturbing ideas to enhance storytelling or emotion are totally lost, because these games would rather sell to a mass audience of demanding, undiscerning, and very impressionable consumers. Children. That's without even opening up the complex can of worms that's the question of whether horror is even appropriate for children, but there's no time to discuss that now. So that's how the ethos of the chain base changed. Multiple factors in the popularity of indie mascot horror games, appealing mascot characters, half-baked improvised lore containing themes of childhood nostalgia and cheating death, all culminating into a trend of imitation that developers chased and made games with. But you already knew that. Popularity, it's what Dags and the rest have already covered. You know, the breadth, the width of this topic, it's already been explored. What I'm bringing to the table is ethos. In pursuit of success, these newer games retained the old chain-base's superficial features and genre similarities, but lost the definitive artistic integrity, the moral values, the authenticity below the surface of these innovative indie games. We've explained how, so now it's time for why. Evidently, this kind of ethos isn't essential for success, so why did it become a trend to become so reliant on imitation and conformity, to reject the authenticity and transparency that previously defined the chain base, for the likes of Joey Drew Studios itself and Mob Games to ditch innovation and morality for samey content and selfishness? What central idea underpins all of this? Greed. The answer is greed. It's a problem as old as history. In this context specifically though, greed led people down a path of game development without bothering to work up the talent necessary to make something meaningful. Greed encouraged these developers to chase trends and tropes, to get that game theory or Markiplier video instead of doing something unique, something that improved the game. Greed was the motivation for them to emphasize marketability and appeal to children despite being completely unfitting for creating horror. The day one merch launches, the YouTube Kids fan content, it's all about being popular and thus boosting sales and therefore making more money. No regard for honesty or art. Greed not only explains why these chain-based games have decreased in quality, however, they also highlight all the negative side effects of this deterioration. Number 1, reputation. Lazy, samey trite is not only the norm now, but specifically the norm of all the biggest and best-selling games of the indie mascot horror genre. The games that represent the entire genre. That makes the issues prevalent in all of these games definitive, despite the relatively low number of examples, giving indie mascot horror games a bad reputation. If this is what the best of the niche looks like, then it can only get worse the deeper you go, right? I don't imagine most outsiders new to this genre since 2020 would view it too kindly. Smaller developers are disadvantaged. I believe that there is an audience for anything, but as trends have evolved in the last couple of years, there is very little hope for them just yet. Persistent success of anti-art, anti-innovation games has actively encouraged smaller developers to aspire to mediocrity, to stifle genuine talent and creativity that doesn't fit the narrow criteria of success, of tropes and degraded, repetitive nonsense that is enforced in this sphere of art, now populated more and more by children. This degraded, repetitive nonsense has eroded the identity of this subgenre to the point now where it is hardly indie, scarcely horror, and really, truthfully, intended for kids unironically now. These games used to excellently parody themes of childhood and nostalgia in irony to heighten good horror, but now they have shifted into pandering to children and selling products that are children's games attached to horror by name and history only. The identity and integrity of this art form has been decimated by greed. So, to conclude, indie mascot horror games in the early 2020s have devolved into inauthentic and degraded versions of themselves, lacking the artistic integrity that previously defined their ethos. More and more authentically frightening, meaningful, and innovative video games have degenerated into repetitive, unoriginal garbage, with more focus on marketability, appeal to children, and profit over creativity. The developers of these games have moved away from trying to create unique, scary, engaging products and are now pumping out soulless, lazy, cash grab games that water down all elements of horror and quality for the sake of marketable characters and merchandising. They are living, but also dead. Living in success, but dead in ethos. Undead. Like a walking corpse, killed by greed. So, that's it. My argument, my thesis. I know it all sounds doom and gloom. I can't exactly make the devolution of a cultural ethos look good. But now that I've taken the time to lay it all out, intro to conclusion, I want to point some things out that I specifically avoided mentioning before. We are not alone. Phoenix, Milo, Dax, these are just 3 of the many creators more influential than I in recognizing and addressing this issue. Gob has mixed reviews rather than positive, which is still ridiculous, but massive progress from the cult insanity of the Security Breach Steam reviews. I didn't mention what happened to all the less popular games, the ones that didn't become massive hits on the same scale as the 5 selected. Choo Choo Charles, Doki Doki Literature Club Plus, and even Iron Lung, if that counts. These games, old and new, still hold the authenticity and transparency of that chain-based ethos pre-2020. They're just flying under the radar. There's also the non-horror games of the chain-base, such as Undertale and Cuphead, both of which had prospered outside the realm of FNAF with Deltarune and The Delicious Last Course, games that are beyond the scope of this video due to not being horror games, so there isn't really as much for me to say about them. I'd like to talk even further about the prime example of this though, Baldi's Basics. New IPs aside, out of every single game from the indie mascot horror chain base of the late 2010s, Baldi's Basics is the only one left that hasn't succumbed to degradation and is still in active development. Baldi is the last man standing. I personally believe that the full release of Baldi's Basics Plus might mark the end of the era of indie mascot horror, if that hasn't happened already. So yes, surprise! Hashtag Baldi promotion! Go play Classic Remastered, seriously. It's beautifully ironic and goofy in a way that never takes itself seriously, and directly pokes fun at games like FNAF and Bendy, without losing high quality gameplay or polish in its UI, sound design, graphics, etc., and without being cynical either. There is as much to enjoy unironically in the Baldi games as there is irony in its style. Thank Micah McGonagall for staying true to himself and not falling to the lure of marketability that so many of his peers did. See, there are plenty of good games, and some of them are doing pretty well. They have gotten attention, but they're insignificant compared to the viral, continuous successes of the games that have lost their integrity in greedy pursuits of popularity and enabled others such as PP and Gob to rise to virality when much more unique and artistic experiences are just comparatively unsuccessful. And I mentioned the blame game earlier. Everyone's to blame. We, the consumers who followed these franchises along, the people who paid money to the developers to buy these games, the ones who shared them on YouTube with our videos, our theories, our let's plays, we are propagating the presence and feeding into all these same issues, because even bad fame is still fame. In making this video, doesn't matter how negative I might be, I am perpetuating these games' position in popular culture because I'm continuing the conscious awareness of it in your mind. Good or bad, it doesn't matter. They live in our heads rent-free. This is partly our fault. So rather than playing the blame game, pointing fingers, perhaps we should all just put our differences aside, forget the past, and work together to alleviate this injustice. This is a fiasco. It needs solving, but how? How do we turn the tide of culture? Nothing lasts forever. Could this just solve itself eventually and burn out? Well, I don't know if we can rely on that. I won't lie to you. I don't have some all-encompassing solution. I don't have some grand theory. I don't even have enough power to impose any kind of fix on my own anyway, but I do have a few suggestions, and I think having a conversation is our best starting point. One way to solve this might be for indie mascot horror games to just start marketing themselves differently to appeal to a different audience, with less emphasis and avoidance of primarily marketable mascot antagonist themes of childhood, dull gameplay, and needlessly convoluted lore. Just straight up avoid all the pitfalls that all of the chain-based games fell into. Making themselves higher rated for whatever reason would be great in keeping kids away too. Developers could just leave this whole space, stop competing with whatever the hell FNAF has become, and aim for an entirely different audience. Ditch the mascot part of indie horror. Lean into originality. Perhaps, alternatively, developers could start leaning the other way. If we start to see a rise in games like these without the horror tag, games that honestly accept that they are intended for kids and repetitive in all the usual ways without trying to take away from the high quality indie mascot horror market, perhaps then a clearer split between the genres would occur and indie mascot horror would finally be liberated of these tropey kids games. I just think that moves the problem elsewhere rather than solving it though. We can't rely on these possibilities anyways. What we as individuals all need to do is get together and educate ourselves and have discussions like this more and more, and as a collective come together and have this conversation so that we stop buying into greed, especially when children are involved. To whoever's watching this, if you want to help me out, share this video. I don't care about likes, I don't care about subscriptions, just keep this conversation going, get it out there, get as many people thinking, talking, and engaging with it as possible. You know, everything starts with an idea, a conversation, and I'm not the first here, I'm not special, I'm just one of many. We need to really collectively come together for this, so maybe we can work together to figure something out, to finally end this soulless era of indie mascot horror games. I believe in redemption and compromise. I believe that collectively, as a community, we can improve, be it restoring the past or evolving into an entirely new ethos. And that would be it. That's the end of the video. Like and subscribe. But there is one other thing. See, ever since Security Breach, the FNAF fandom turned back to all of the previous games to try and find out what went wrong, to justify the vitriol towards Security Breach. I mean, there hadn't been regular releases in the series for years by that point, and of course, by extension, we've seen this with all of the other chain-based IPs mentioned in this video, if to a lesser extent. Everyone has their own reviews and opinions, but maybe there is something else to explain our general distaste for the newer games. Maybe we're getting older. We are the ones changing, and these games, they were never good in the first place. We were young, we were undiscerning, and now we've just got higher standards. We grew up. The children who buy into the hollow ethos of Hello Neighbor 2 and Bending in the Dark Revival are just our replacements. We bought into Hello Neighbor 1 and Bending in the Ink Machine, same developers, same controversial people. Are these games really any different? I mean, if you really look at this objectively, the mass popularity of all of these games, old and new, the thing that boosted them into the realm of kids' entertainment and YouTuber Let's Plays were the bright, colourful characters and appealing designs. It's the same today as it was in 2014. I was 13 years old when I first got into Five Nights at Freddy's, and now I'm almost 22. Times change, people change, and this comes back to my doubts. My doubts in myself, my doubts in everything I've said, because when thinking about the old and new, when your personal experience is involved, how likely is it that you've completely negated nostalgia or bias? How assured can I be in my own opinion that I'm right when I'm personally involved? I have to believe in my own judgment, because I can't be completely wrong either, and then what's the point of this video? All I know is that indie mascot horror games just aren't the same anymore. There was a time, a golden age, I dare say, when we didn't have scandal, controversy, and misery every month, and these games actually meant something. Is that copium? Is that denial? Or does all my experience and knowledge and immersion in this culture for the last 10 years actually have some value? Anyways, I put a lot of time and effort into this video. I hope you enjoyed. Any support is appreciated, but absolutely not obligatory. If you want to leave a dislike, do it. Just please comment down below justifying that. I need to know why people would do that. Forgive me for a moment for being a bit self-indulgent here and talking about myself and the channel for a bit. I don't really have another place to adequately do this, and the following few minutes are for the benefit of my subscribers. I know that this video would be a pretty much perfect bittersweet send-off to Continuity Error, but really, this channel is just getting started. I know, the name of this channel has been an unintentional irony. There have been multiple errors in the continuity of what this channel is all about, and that is no one's fault but my own. Sure, FNAF lore videos aren't going to go away, but since there are so few uploads here, with every new video the channel is becoming a little bit more defined by different IPs and different types of videos, and all of the original ideas for content here were only ever limited to the bits of the FNAF lore I can tolerate anyways, all of which has been extensively covered for years already, and that Rytos has done better. Respect, but catharsis. It has taken me far too long to make this video. I could, you know, say whatever excuse I like. Holidays, illness, time constraints, struggles with the script. This is the 4th time I've recorded this, start to finish. I am gonna be so relieved to finally put this behind me. I've said everything I wanted to. I don't see what new developments could warrant my attention, so, you know what? This topic. I'm going to go back to making videos I enjoy, videos I'm passionate about, videos on thought-provoking experiences that instead of being driven by spite and hatred are driven by love and respect. I'm going to go back to making videos on interesting experiences, thought-provoking games, and culture that isn't tainted by corruption and greed, okay? This video is a response to Garten of Banban. That was the thing that ticked me off, pushed me over the edge, and got me to make this. And, you know, I wanted to start 2023 with this big commentary on the meta that's been all-encompassing of, like, the last 10 years of, you know, this culture. And that is the reason why there's been no other videos in the meantime. I put them all off for this, so hopefully videos release a bit more quickly after this one, since I've got a bunch of scripts that are basically ready to go. I just need to record them, but whatever happens, I thought it would be good to make this video because this is demonstrating some self-awareness. Again, no matter how you feel about it, it was too important for me to not address. So, thank you all so much for watching. Subscribe and speculate. What's going to happen to indie mascot horror games in the next year, 5 years, 10 years? Where's the chain base, or whatever legacy it leaves, going to go in the future?